Once there was an island that the world cannot forget. It does not appear on maps. It has no exact coordinates. It leaves no confirmed ruins, and yet it lives. It lives in ancient books. It lives in theories. It lives in the collective imagination of humanity. Its name is Atlantis, a civilization so advanced it seemed impossible, so powerful it dominated the seas, so prosperous it shone as a model of perfection, and so fragile that it disappeared in a single night. The story begins more than 2,000 years ago. A Greek philosopher decides to tell a tale. He does not speak of capricious gods. He does not speak of mythical heroes. He speaks of an organized society, of laws, of temples, of engineering, of power. He speaks of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, beyond the known world, a power that challenged Athens, a culture that aspired to dominate everything, and that fell, not slowly, not through progressive decay, but abruptly, in a single day and a night of misfortune, earthquakes, floods, the sea opening up, and then silence. Since then, the question has never disappeared. Was it real? Did a lost civilization exist under the ocean? Or was it a warning disguised as a story? Because more unsettling than its location is its meaning. Atlantis does not represent just a place. It represents the vertigo of progress, the arrogance of power, the illusion of invulnerability. Every generation has seen its own reflection in it. The Roman Empire remembered it without naming it. Colonial powers dreamed of it. Technological modernity reimagined it as a superior civilization. And always the same image returns: a brilliant society that believed itself to be eternal. Perhaps we will never find its remains. Perhaps it never existed as we imagine it, but that has not stopped it from outliving any real city, because Atlantis does not need ruins to exist. It exists as a warning. It exists as a symbol. It exists as a question. What happens when a civilization reaches its peak? And what happens when it crosses the invisible line between greatness and hubris? Before the sea claimed it, before it became a myth, before its name awakened obsessions, Atlantis was described as the perfect model, an orderly empire, rich, advanced, and doomed. This is the story of that impossible island, the story of how the most powerful myth of the West was born, and of why, thousands of years later, we are still searching for a city that may never have been there. Because sometimes the stories we cannot prove are the ones that reveal the most about us. And it all begins with a philosopher, an island beyond the horizon, and a night when the world changed forever. Everything we know about Atlantis comes from a single man. Not from sailors, not from explorers, not from archaeologists, from a philosopher. His name was Plato, and he wrote the story more than 2,300 years ago in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. They were not fantasy books. They were philosophical texts, debates about politics, about morals, about the nature of power. And in the midst of these discussions, an unexpected story appears. Plato sets the story 9,000 years before his time. He speaks of an island located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, beyond the world known to the Greeks, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, according to his words. A vast territory, fertile, rich in metals, with an abundance of wood, animals, and natural resources. But it wasn't just its size that was extraordinary. it was its organization. Atlantis, according to Plato, was founded by Poseidon. The god of the sea fell in love with a mortal woman named Clito. To protect her, he created a unique city. He excavated concentric rings of land and water around a central hill. A perfect design, alternating circles of sea and land, canals that connected to the ocean, bridges that joined the rings, monumental engineering. In the center stood the temple of Poseidon, covered in gold, silver, and a mysterious metal called orichalcum, a civilization that mastered architecture, navigation, agriculture, warfare, a maritime power. Political power was also carefully structured. Poseidon had 10 sons. He divided the island into 10 regions. Each son ruled a part. But the eldest, Atlas, gave his name to the kingdom, Atlantis. The kings swore loyalty to one another. They met in council. They followed laws inscribed on columns of orichalcum. It was an orderly system, stable, hierarchical. It was not chaos, it was structure. And then, the conflict. Plato describes a war. Atlantis, driven by its growing power, began to expand. It conquered territories in the Mediterranean. It subjugated peoples. It advanced towards Greece until it encountered Athens. Not the imperial Athens of Pericles, but an ancestral, idealized Athens, a virtuous society, moderate, brave. According to Plato, Athens resisted alone and won. The small, virtuous city defeated the arrogant empire. And then the cataclysm. After the war came the punishment. Violent earthquakes, massive floods. In a single day and a terrible night, Atlantis sank beneath the sea. It disappeared. The ocean covered it, and the place became impassable, a shoal of mud that prevented navigation. End of the empire, end of the island, end of the story. But here, the crucial question arises. Why did Plato tell this story? He presents no evidence. He does not cite direct witnesses. He says the story comes from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, a distant chain of transmission, ancient, impossible to verify. Was it a historical account or a political allegory? Many scholars believe Atlantis was not geography. It was a warning, a critique of imperial arrogance, a mirror for Athens, a clear message: power without virtue leads to destruction. What's fascinating is that Plato never finished the story. The dialogue, Critias, is left unfinished. It breaks off, as if the tale were suspended in time. And perhaps that is what made it eternal, because it left space. Space to imagine, to speculate, to search.
Since then, entire generations have tried to answer a simple question. Did Plato invent Atlantis? Or worse yet, did he base his warning on something real? And if it was real, where is it? Thus begins the mystery. Not with underwater ruins, not with ancient maps, but with words, a philosopher, a dialogue, a story that refused to disappear. And from that story, the world began to search for an island that perhaps never wanted to be found. If Atlantis was just a myth, Plato described it with unsettling precision. He didn't speak of primitive huts. He didn't speak of scattered tribes. He described a superpower, a civilization organized down to the detail, rich beyond imagination, advanced in engineering, agriculture, and navigation. Atlantis wasn't just large, it was sophisticated. The island was structured with an almost mathematical logic. In the center, a sacred hill. Around it, concentric rings of water and land. 3 circles of sea, 2 of land. A system of canals that connected directly to the ocean. Ships could sail from the open sea to the heart of the city. It was a natural harbor turned into a masterpiece, a city designed, not improvised. Each ring was protected by walls, coated with different metals, bronze, tin, and the mysterious orichalcum, a reddish metal that, according to Plato, shone like fire. Some believe it was refined copper. Others consider it a symbol of lost wealth. The truth is that, in the account, Atlantis gleamed, literally. The agriculture was equally impressive. The island produced in abundance, grains, fruits, livestock. There were advanced irrigation systems, canals that distributed water efficiently, a territorial planning that anticipated modern urban models. They did not depend on chance, they depended on design. The political structure also seemed stable. 10 kingdoms, a council of kings, laws engraved on metal columns, ritual oaths, a system that combined divine authority and rational administration. It was not uncontrolled tyranny, it was order. Atlantis did not fall for lack of structure. It fell, according to Plato, from an excess of power. Militarily, they were formidable. A gigantic fleet, war chariots, organized infantry, cavalry. They controlled strategic sea routes. They extended their influence across the Mediterranean. They became the arbiters of trade and war. They were the center of their world, and they knew it. But there is something unsettling in the description. Atlantis is not portrayed as barbaric. It is not savage. It is civilized, advanced, brilliant, and that makes it more disturbing. Because its fall does not come from ignorance, it comes from corruption. Plato makes it clear that, in the beginning, the Atlanteans were virtuous, descendants of a god, balanced, just, moderate. But over time, something changed. The divine blood was diluted. The human part gained ground, and with it, ambition, the desire to dominate beyond what was necessary, the pride of believing themselves invincible. It is here that the story ceases to be a description and begins to become a warning. Atlantis was not destroyed by weakness, it was destroyed by excess. Excess of wealth, excess of confidence, excess of power. Prosperity created arrogance. Arrogance created expansion. Expansion created conflict. And the conflict created the end. The most fascinating thing is that, centuries later, we still recognize that pattern. Civilizations that reach their peak, that master technology, commerce, culture, that believe they have surpassed natural limits, and that forget something essential. No structure, however perfect it may seem, is immune to internal imbalance. Atlantis was described as the ideal model, but also as the ultimate example of decadence. A civilization so advanced that it could only be defeated by itself.
And that idea, more than any underwater ruin, is what has kept its story alive. Because if such an organized society could fall, what makes us think that ours cannot? In the next chapter, we will delve into that breaking point, the moment when greatness turns into hubris, and the warning becomes a sentence.
In the beginning, Atlantis was balance, wealth without arrogance, power without abuse, strength without tyranny. Descendants of Poseidon, the first kings ruled with moderation. They respected the laws. They honored their pacts. They maintained order. But no civilization remains intact forever, and time changes even the most solid empires. Plato describes it with a key phrase: the divine part began to be diluted. It was not an immediate change. It was not a revolution. It was not a coup d'état. It was something slower, more dangerous, gradual. Generation after generation, the divine blood lost its strength. Human nature, ambitious, desirous, competitive, began to dominate. And when power is no longer perceived as a responsibility, it transforms into an entitlement. Atlantis had reached a dominant position. It controlled trade routes. It possessed an imposing fleet. It had almost unlimited resources. And when a civilization feels that nothing can challenge it, it begins to cross boundaries. Expansion ceased to be for defense. It became conquest. Trade ceased to be an exchange. It became an imposition. Leadership ceased to be an example. It became domination. It is here that Plato introduces the true moral core of the story. The decline did not begin in the walls. It did not begin in the economy. It did not begin in the political structure. It began in the character. Pride replaced prudence. Abundance replaced moderation. Security replaced vigilance. Atlantis did not fall because it was weak. It fell because it believed itself to be invulnerable. There is a pattern that repeats in human history. When power is new, it is wielded with caution. When power is consolidated, it is wielded with confidence. When power seems eternal, it is wielded with arrogance. And arrogance, in any era, invites disaster. In Plato's account, the gods watch. Zeus summons the gods to council. The humanity of the Atlanteans had overcome their virtue. Their ambition threatened the balance of the world. The punishment was not immediate. It was deliberate, as if the universe itself needed to restore order. And here the story ceases to be just an ancient narrative. It becomes a mirror, because Atlantis does not just represent a lost island. It represents the moment a civilization loses awareness of its limits, the moment when success ceases to be enough and transforms into obsession, the moment when greatness becomes hubris. What is unsettling is that Plato does not describe internal rebellions. He does not speak of extreme poverty. He does not mention economic collapses. He describes something more subtle, a moral deterioration, an invisible transformation. The system was still functioning. The city was still brilliant. The temples were still standing. But the collective soul had changed. And when the soul of a civilization changes, so does its destiny. Perhaps that is why the myth has survived. Because it does not speak of an external enemy. It speaks of the internal one. Excessive confidence, unchecked expansion, the illusion of permanence. Atlantis was powerful. Atlantis was advanced. Atlantis was orderly. And yet, it fell, not out of ignorance, but out of excess. In the next chapter, we will see the final moment, not the slow decline, not the prolonged decay, but the night the sea reclaimed what pride had built. Because in the story of Atlantis, the warning does not end with corruption. It ends with a cataclysm.
There were no decades of visible decline. There were no prolonged invasions. There was no slow imperial agony. According to Plato, it all happened suddenly, in a single day and a terrible night. A brief phrase, but enough to fuel centuries of imagination. the earth began to tremble. Not a slight tremor, not an isolated jolt, but a chain of violent earthquakes. The island, which seemed eternal, began to fracture. The canals broke, the walls gave way, the temples cracked, the perfect order turned into chaos. And then came the water. The sea, which had been a source of power and wealth, became a sentence. Gigantic waves, massive floods, the ocean advancing without resistance. Atlantis was not conquered by a human enemy. It was absorbed by nature. The same force that had enabled its maritime dominance now reclaimed it. Plato offers no technical details. He does not speak of tectonic plates. He does not mention volcanoes. He does not describe tsunamis in scientific language. But his description suggests something clear: a geological collapse, a natural catastrophe of monumental scale. And when it was over, the island disappeared. Not partially, not in visible ruins, but under the sea, submerged, as if it had never existed. The place became a shoal of mud, impossible to navigate, an obstacle in the ocean, a physical memory of a lost civilization. And with that, the myth was sealed. But here arises the question that has obsessed generations. Can an entire civilization disappear like that? Real history tells us yes. Cities buried by volcanic eruptions, empires razed by earthquakes, cultures destroyed by tsunamis. Nature does not negotiate. It does not distinguish between the virtuous and the arrogant. It does not respect walls or temples. When it unleashes its force, it does so without mercy. However, in Plato's account, the disaster is not just geological. It is moral. The cataclysm is a consequence, not an accident. It is a punishment, the restoration of a lost balance. And that interpretation is what turned Atlantis into something more than a possible submerged island. It turned it into a symbol, because sudden destruction has a unique narrative power. It leaves no time for redemption. It allows no correction. It offers no second chances. One day you are on top of the world. The next, you do not exist. Perhaps that is why the myth remains so potent. It does not describe a slow and boring fall. It describes an absolute end, a brutal reminder that progress does not guarantee permanence, that technology does not guarantee security, that wealth does not guarantee continuity. Atlantis had everything, and it lost everything in one night. And here, the ancient tale becomes unsettlingly modern. We live in an era of coastal cities, complex infrastructures, technological dependence, confidence in systems we believe are indestructible. But nature is still there, silent, unpredictable. The cataclysm of Atlantis may have been a myth. It may have been an allegory. It may have been a distorted memory of a real event. But its message transcends geography. No civilization is exempt from vulnerability. No system is permanent, and no society is beyond the natural balance. In the next chapter, we will leave the realm of pure myth, and we will enter the search. Because if Atlantis sank, where? In what sea? On what continent?
And is there any possibility that Plato's story has a kernel of truth?
If Atlantis was real, it must have been somewhere. You can't sink a non-existent island. An imaginary city cannot disappear beneath a real ocean. And yet, for more than 2,000 years, no one has been able to point to an exact spot on the map. The search began almost immediately after Plato. Ancient philosophers debated whether it should be taken literally. Some considered it an allegory, others a historical memory. But as time went on, the question changed. Not what does Atlantis mean, but where is it? The initial clue seems clear. Plato places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Today we know that place as the Strait of Gibraltar. That would point to the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, the very name of the ocean seems to echo the legend, Atlantic, the Sea of Atlas. But the Atlantic is vast, too vast. Was it a lost island in the middle of the ocean, a submerged continent, or a geographical exaggeration? In the 19th century, the theory took a radical turn. Some authors began to imagine Atlantis as an entire continent, a mother civilization, the source of Egypt, of Mesoamerica, of ancient cultures separated by oceans. A fascinating idea, but without solid proof. Modern geology tells us something clear. There is no sunken continent in the Atlantic. Tectonic plates do not allow entire continental masses to disappear without a trace. So the search changed direction. Some researchers look towards the Mediterranean. One hypothesis stands out above all others: the island of Santorini. In the Bronze Age, the Minoan civilization flourished there, advanced, maritime, prosperous, until around 1600 BC, a devastating volcanic eruption shook the region. The Thera explosion was one of the largest in antiquity. It generated tsunamis, destroyed cities, darkened skies. A sudden disaster, a maritime culture struck by a cataclysm. The similarities are unsettling, but there is a problem. Santorini is in the Mediterranean, not beyond Gibraltar, and the timeline does not match the 9,000 years mentioned by Plato. Others have looked towards southern Spain, near the Doñana marshes. Some studies have identified possible circular structures under sediment, remains that could have been ancient cities. But so far, nothing conclusive, nothing definitive. The theories don't stop there. The Caribbean has been proposed, Antarctica, the Azores, even America. Each hypothesis reflects the desire to find it more than the evidence of its existence. And perhaps that is revealing. The search for Atlantis is not just archaeological, it's psychological. We want it to exist. We want there to have been a superior civilization. We want the past to hide a monumental secret. Because finding Atlantis would be more than solving a mystery. It would be rewriting human history. But science is relentless. So far, there is no direct physical proof. There are no confirmed ruins under the ocean that match Plato's description. There are no remains of a superpower that disappeared in a day and a night. What there is are possibilities, interpretations, and an ancient story that refuses to disappear. Perhaps Atlantis is not in the open ocean. Perhaps it is in the distorted memory of a real disaster, an eruption, a tsunami, a razed city whose story was amplified over time. Because catastrophes are remembered and stories grow.
The question is no longer just where is it? It is also, are we looking for a physical place or a metaphor buried in history? In the next chapter, we will see how the myth survived beyond Greece, how it crossed centuries, how it was reinterpreted, and how a simple philosophical story ended up becoming the most persistent obsession of the ancient and modern world.
After Plato came silence. No major Greek historian confirmed the existence of Atlantis. No ancient geographer recorded its location. Aristotle, Plato's student, was blunt. He who invented it also made it disappear. For many in antiquity, Atlantis was an allegory, a philosophical device, a story designed to illustrate a political idea. And yet, it never completely vanished. Some later writers mentioned it. Strabo doubted. Pliny the Elder considered it improbable. Others treated it as a curiosity. But no one investigated it seriously. It was not a priority. The ancient world was full of real mysteries, expanding empires, constant wars, new territories to explore. Atlantis was an interesting story, nothing more. For centuries, the story lay dormant, preserved in manuscripts, copied by scribes, passed down as part of the Greek philosophical legacy, not as a historical chronicle. And then, something unexpected happened. Europe rediscovered Plato. In the Renaissance, classical texts began to circulate widely again. Intellectuals began to read the Timaeus and Critias again, and in an age of maritime exploration, the idea of a lost land took on new life. Christopher Columbus sailed west looking for Asia, and he found an unknown continent, America. The world expanded, maps were redrawn, and suddenly the possibility of lost lands was no longer absurd. Some began to wonder, what if Atlantis was in the New World? What if the indigenous peoples were descendants of an ancient, advanced civilization? Speculations grew, without solid evidence, but with abundant imagination. Atlantis was no longer just philosophy, it became a historical hypothesis. In the following centuries, the fascination grew. The Enlightenment tried to rationalize the myth. Romanticism embraced it with enthusiasm. The idea of a lost civilization fit perfectly with the sensibility of an era that valued the sublime, the mysterious, the tragic. Atlantis became a symbol of a lost golden age, an ancient paradise, a better world before the collapse. The curious thing is that at this stage, the story began to transform. Plato had described an arrogant, expansionist power, but many reinterpreted Atlantis as a wise, spiritual, almost utopian civilization. The myth began to soften, to be idealized, to become something Plato had probably not intended. It was no longer just a warning, it was nostalgia. In the late 19th century, a book changed everything. Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In it, he argued that Atlantis had been real, that it had been the source of all ancient civilizations, Egypt, Mesoamerica, Europe, a mother culture destroyed by a cataclysm. The book was a success, and since then, Atlantis was no longer just an ancient story. It became a cultural phenomenon. What is fascinating is that each era projected its own desires onto Atlantis. In antiquity, it was a moral warning. In the Renaissance, it was a land to be discovered. In Romanticism, it was a lost paradise. In the 19th century, it was a mother civilization. In the 20th century, it was an archaeological mystery. The myth evolved, but it never died. Because Atlantis has something few stories possess: ambiguity. It is not confirmed, it is not absolutely refuted.
It dwells in an intermediate space, between history and fiction, between warning and memory, between philosophy and obsession. And perhaps that ambiguity is its greatest strength.
If Plato had been more precise, if he had given exact coordinates, if he had offered irrefutable proof, Atlantis might have been just another chapter in ancient history. But by leaving room for doubt, he created an eternal myth. In the next chapter, we will enter the modern view: science, geology, archaeology, and we will see if, behind the persistent myth, an echo of reality can be hidden.
For centuries, Atlantis was the realm of philosophers and dreamers. But with the arrival of modern science, the question changed. It was no longer enough to imagine. It had to be proven. Geologists, archaeologists, oceanographers, they all looked at the myth with a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Could an advanced civilization disappear without a trace? Geology offers a first answer. Continents do not sink suddenly. Tectonic plates move slowly. Mountains rise over millions of years. Oceans open over geological eras. The idea of an entire continent swallowed by the sea in one night does not fit with what we know about the planet. There is no evidence of a missing landmass in the recent Atlantic. The ocean floor has been mapped, and there are no remains of monumental cities under kilometers of water. But science also recognizes something important. Catastrophes exist. Devastating volcanic eruptions, gigantic tsunamis, earthquakes that destroy entire cities in minutes. Pompeii was buried in hours. Akrotiri on Santorini was buried under volcanic ash. Entire civilizations can collapse quickly, not by magic, but by nature. This is where many researchers return to the eruption of Thera. Around 1600 BC, the volcanic island exploded with colossal force. The impact was regional. Tsunamis struck coastlines. The Minoan civilization, an advanced maritime power, suffered an irreversible blow. Ports destroyed, infrastructure collapsed, trade networks disrupted. A brilliant culture weakened in a matter of days. Could that memory have traveled to Egypt? Could it have been transformed over time? Could it have become, centuries later, the story Plato heard? It's possible, but it is not a certainty. Modern archaeology has found many lost cities, under sand, under jungle, under layers of time, but none match the description of Atlantis exactly. There are no perfect concentric rings under the ocean, no temples of orichalcum, no remains of a submerged Atlantic superpower. Direct evidence is still missing. So science faces a paradox. The myth is not geologically plausible in its literal form, but it is plausible that it is based on a real disaster, a traumatic event, amplified by generations, transformed into a symbol. Because human memory does not work like an exact archive, it works like a narrative, and narratives adapt, they expand, they are dramatized. Science also reveals something more uncomfortable. Complex civilizations can disappear. The Roman Empire collapsed. The Mayan civilization abandoned cities. The Hittite Empire vanished. Sophisticated systems can fail due to war, due to climate, due to economy, due to natural disaster. It is not impossible. It is history. Perhaps the right scientific question is not, did Atlantis exist exactly as Plato described it, but is it possible for an advanced culture to disappear abruptly? The answer is yes, and that possibility keeps the doubt alive. Science has not confirmed Atlantis, but neither has it completely eliminated the possibility that the myth preserves a kernel of truth, a distorted memory, a distant echo, a warning based on real events wrapped in philosophical symbolism, because sometimes historical truth does not present itself intact, it presents itself fragmented, disguised, turned into a myth.
In the next chapter, we will leave scientific ground and enter a more unexpected realm, esotericism, mystical reinterpretations, Atlantis as a lost spiritual civilization. Because if science seeks proof, imagination seeks meaning.
When science found no ruins, imagination found an empire. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Atlantis ceased to be just a historical mystery. It became something more, a spiritual civilization, a superior culture, a lost world of forbidden knowledge. Theosophy was one of the currents that most transformed the myth. Elena Blavatsky spoke of root races, civilizations prior to known history. Atlantis was no longer just an island. It was an evolutionary stage of humanity, a cycle before our own, advanced, technologically superior, spiritually powerful, and destroyed by its own decadence. In these reinterpretations, Atlanteans didn't just master the sea, they mastered energies, crystals, invisible forces, knowledge that we would consider science fiction today. Atlantis became the mother of Egypt, of the Mayans, of ancient civilizations separated by oceans, a primeval global culture, a common origin, without archaeological proof, but with enormous narrative power. Why did this version gain so much strength? Because it responds to a deep human need, the need to believe there was a golden age, a time when humanity was wiser, more connected, more advanced, and that something was lost. Esoteric Atlantis is not a political warning, it is cosmic nostalgia. In the 20th century, the myth mingled with modern spiritual movements, New Age, ancestral energies, channelings, memories of past lives in Atlantis. The island was transformed into a symbol of higher consciousness, of clean technology, of harmony with the universe. Curiously, the opposite of Plato's version. Where there was arrogance, now there is enlightenment. Where there was imperialism, now there is wisdom. The myth was rewritten, adapted to the desire of each era. Even cinema and literature amplified this image. Atlantis became a setting for adventures, for advanced science, for shining underwater cities, a lost world waiting to be rediscovered. Fiction fueled the fascination, and fascination fueled new beliefs. But here something interesting arises. Although these interpretations lack scientific evidence, they are not irrelevant, because they show something profound. Atlantis is no longer just an ancient story, it is an archetype. The archetype of the fallen civilization, the archetype of lost knowledge, the archetype of the destroyed paradise. Each culture projects its fears and hopes onto it. Deep down, all versions share a common core: an advanced society, a moment of imbalance, a sudden collapse, and an irreversible loss. Whether moral, technological, or spiritual, Atlantis always represents what could have been and ceased to be. Perhaps there were never energy crystals. Perhaps a primeval global civilization never existed. But the persistence of these ideas reveals something more important than evidence. It reveals our obsession with origin, with the fall,
with forgotten knowledge, because Atlantis is not just a lost island, it is a flexible metaphor. It can be a political warning. It can be a natural catastrophe. It can be a mother civilization. It can be a spiritual utopia. Its form changes, but its essence remains.
Because perhaps the true Atlantis is not under the sea. It is in the pattern that repeats throughout history.
Something sets Atlantis apart from other lost cities. We have no confirmed ruins. We have no inscriptions. We have no unequivocal archaeological remains. And yet, it is one of the most famous civilizations in history. That says something. The myths that survive do not do so by chance. They survive because they contain a truth deeper than facts. Atlantis does not need exact coordinates. It needs meaning. And its meaning is clear: the rise and the fall. Every civilization that has reached its peak has believed at some point that it was different, that its technology protected it, that its army secured it, that its wealth made it invulnerable. Rome believed it. The colonial empires believed it. Modern powers believe it too. And at that point of maximum confidence, fragility appears. Atlantis represents the exact moment a society crosses an invisible line, when success ceases to be balance and becomes excess, when expansion ceases to be a necessity and becomes limitless ambition, when progress ceases to be a tool and becomes an identity. That point is dangerous because it is silent. The myth also contains another powerful element: the speed of the collapse. Not centuries of decline, not a slow transition. One day you are at the top, the next you do not exist. That brutal contrast is what makes Atlantis an eternal warning. But the myth does not only speak of destruction, it speaks of memory. Atlantis was erased physically, but not culturally. Its story outlived any wall, any temple, any shining metal. And that reveals something fundamental. True immortality is not material, it is narrative. Perhaps that is why the story never dies, because it functions as a mirror. Each generation reads it in its own way. In times of war, it is a warning against imperialism. In times of technological progress, it is a warning against scientific arrogance. In times of climate crisis, it is a warning against environmental imbalance. Atlantis adapts because the pattern it represents is universal. Civilizations are born, they organize, they prosper, they expand, they become strained, and finally they face their limits. Not always with spectacular sinkings, but with inevitable transformations. Human history is a succession of Atlantises, some documented, others forgotten. Perhaps that is the reason we keep searching for it, not because we want to find a city under the sea, but because we want to understand the cycle. We want to know if collapse is inevitable. We want to know if it can be avoided. We want to know if we are different. Atlantis poses an uncomfortable question. Is progress linear or cyclical? If every civilization contains within itself the seeds of its own downfall, then history is not an infinite march forward. It is a series of rises and corrections, of excesses and restorations. In the final chapter, we will leave the ancient myth behind and look to ourselves. Because if Atlantis is a warning, what is it warning of today? And are we listening?
Imagine for a moment that tomorrow the oceans rise, that a coastal city disappears, that entire infrastructures are left underwater, that what seemed permanent becomes a memory. It wouldn't be the first time. Human history is full of lost cities, some due to war, others due to climate, others due to mistake. Perhaps the right question was never, "Where is Atlantis?" Perhaps the right question is, "What does it represent?" Atlantis represents the moment a civilization believes it has mastered nature, the moment technology seems to overcome any limit, the moment power seems irreversible. And that moment is always delicate. Today, we live in an era of impressive achievements, global networks, massive energy, instant communication, gigantic cities, interconnected systems that sustain millions of lives every day. We have never been so advanced, we have never been so complex, and we have never been so dependent on our own stability. Atlantis, deep down, is not a place. It is a structural warning. It reminds us that sophistication does not eliminate vulnerability, that wealth does not eliminate risk, that organization does not eliminate imbalance. Progress can expand faster than prudence, and when that happens, the correction can be abrupt. Perhaps Plato did not want us to search for underwater ruins. Perhaps he wanted us to examine our own cities, our own systems, our own excesses. Because the myth does not say Atlantis was evil, it says it lost its balance. And losing balance is deeply human. Every generation has had its Atlantis, empires that seemed eternal, unquestionable economic models, technologies considered definitive. And yet, history demonstrates something constant. Nothing is permanent. But there is another lesson. Although the city disappeared, the story survived. Although the island sank, the tale emerged. And that means something important. Civilizations can fall, but ideas endure. Warnings are passed down. Myths survive. Atlantis does not need to exist physically to be real. It is real in human conversation, in historical reflection, in the uncomfortable question it leaves open. Are we building something sustainable or something spectacular but fragile? More than 2,000 years ago, a philosopher wrote about an island that disappeared in one night. Perhaps he was not talking about the past. Perhaps he was talking about the future. Because the myth is not about a lost civilization. It is about the constant possibility of losing it. And as long as societies exist that grow, that prosper, that expand, the story of Atlantis will remain relevant. Not as a map, not as a coordinate, but as a mirror. The real Atlantis is not under the ocean. It is in the pattern we repeat. And the question is not whether it existed. The question is whether we have learned anything from its fall.